This is the second lecture on art history, giving you an overview of some of the major movements. Last lecture, we started with the Egyptians and the Greeks. We looked at Roman art and how it reflected Greek art. We looked at early Christian, Byzantine, the early and mid-Gothic time periods, or the Middle Ages. What I want to do first is have a look at this schematic I drew about the general philosophies and subject matter that drove Western art. Over here on the left, we begin with Greek thought. The Greek model for art was that it should reflect in a perfect human body or in a perfectly organized building through the use of mathematics, the glory of the human mind and the actual true construction of reality. So here we see the Greeks. This line here divides two aspects of reality, good and bad. In the good category, or the things to aspire for and to paint about, were things like reason, mathematics, and logic. The things that you do not want to aspire to are things like emotion, because emotions are chaotic and they reflect the chaos of nature. So in classical Greek art, we find sculptures that are very, very calm, well-proportioned, and unexpressive. We find this classical Greek art style repeated and copied through different time periods. The Renaissance means renewal. The art historians that gave this time period this name noticed that there was a resurgence and interest in Greek art and they noted that the time period between the two, early art historians called this the Middle Ages, the age when there was, they thought, no art, no learning, no wisdom. So the idea for them was that these Greek ideas jumped over this time period and started a new beginning for art. The art of the Middle Ages, I hope you saw that, is very different from what we are going to see coming on. Now, this division that the Greeks had during the Renaissance turned into two types of subject matter, the sacred and the secular. So during the Renaissance, we had kind of a marriage of these two ideas. You will see biblical subject matter, you will see biblical ideals and virtues, and they are presented in a very ordered, reasonable way. Married with this idea of sacred subject matter, we have secular subject matter, and that is the subject matter from classical mythology and ideas of emotion and the real world. And over here, as compared to the Greeks, they use a single subject matter. The majority of their artwork was mythological. Stories about the gods were a stand-in for the lower earthly battles that were going on. So again, we have Greek thought divided into two, copied by the Renaissance into sacred and secular. In the Middle Ages, there was no secular. Even what a juggler did was sacred. I want to start with the Renaissance. Time period is from 1400 to 1500. High Renaissance style was established. The ideas for this style were a revival of the Roman and Greek art forms and ideals. What the Renaissance developed was a version and a belief in the strength of the human mind, in the ability of the mind to look at the world around them. Da Vinci was recording and studying and analyzing how light actually worked in the world. And then he began to try to apply these principles. Along with Da Vinci, we have Masaccio, who worked with and developed perspective. These are two very typical artworks of the Renaissance. You will notice that they are both one-point perspective. If you follow any diagonal, this one connects over here to here. This space between the two is where the vanishing points end up. We can follow these diagonals here, and this one here will also bring us back to where the center of the story is, and this is called the flagellation of Christ. Now, the other things I want you to notice are what are called chiaroscuro. And chiaroscuro is that scientific analysis of how light reveals form. And we will see that especially in these figures in their clothing. And the light is present everywhere. You don't see like a high spotlight effect in the Renaissance. It is used to reveal the patterns of light that reveal clothing, because they have studied that to see something closer, you have to have a lighter value. To see something curving, you have to have a gradual transition, and then you have to have a shadow. There is still a very stiffness to classical Renaissance art. This is another story where Christ is giving the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter. And we have this idealized plaza, Italian architecture in the background. Notice again the linear perspective brings or draws people here into this central building here. Notice that the changes in size create a sense of depth. We see it most in the figures. We also have some aerial perspective going on, which is that blues back here are whiter and hazier. They're not as hard-edged. These mountains are not as hard-edged as these edges of these triumphal arches. Here we see close enough to see all of the detail on these figures. So you can see that the colors here are brighter than the colors back there. But people exist within that framework of a natural world, the human world, and human culture. The next time period we're going to look at is the Baroque. The Baroque time period is the next period after the Renaissance. It starts at the end of the Renaissance, about 1500, and goes through the 17th century, about the end of the 17th century. And the term Baroque is derived from a Portuguese word that means irregular surface. It's like a natural pearl. The style got this name because there is no clarity to the surface. There are multiple highlights and secondary accents that enliven the surface. So the style emphasis is on emotion and a really strong sense of action and movement. Okay, this is called The Night Watch by Rembrandt, and I do believe we've looked at it before, early on in the semester. And it's the story of an army regiment getting ready to go out to war. And you can see his interest in creating a very active and dramatic story. We have people gesturing. We have people looking multiple ways. Nobody is in a line. They're all placed so that our eye will follow, but it's not a straight line like you would see during the Renaissance. We have foreshortening, which is a new interest in showing things coming out towards the picture plane so that they look like they're coming forward. And we can see that here in the captain's weapon, that Rembrandt has been able to make it look like it's close here and it goes back in space. So this new interest in depth and space. Primarily we have the Renaissance use of chiaroscuro. And remember, chiaroscuro is the knowledge of how light will form surfaces, will show the body so that they look like true 3D forms. So I'm going to zoom in here on this man, and you can see that the light is coming very dramatically from the left. We have a gradual transition from the light under here and over his chin to the dark side where the shadow is cast because it's turned away from the light. And then we have strong cast shadows under here. So again, they're using this method of shading called chiaroscuro. What they added during this time period is this very dramatic play of light and darkness called tenebrism. What that is it's very hard to see an edge when we turn to the background. You can see that this flag, this edge is not clear, it's fuzzy. As a matter of fact, it's almost difficult to know where exactly the edge of the flag begins. And this would never happen in the Renaissance. We would have really sharp edges from the front to the back. Forms and shapes go back in space. We get this disappearing edge idea. So tenebrism is this idea of light and dark playing across the surface. And it's really well illustrated in this because we see these pockets of bright light highlighting the important parts of the story, the important people, the mascot, the important points of action like loading your rifle, getting your flags, and then the drummer calling the soldiers to action. So now here I'm going to do this comparison side by side. So here we see reality very clear and ordered and understandable. We see how people fit into these scientific systems like perspective. The drama of the story is very stiff. The Night Watch, right next to it, there is a huge difference in the way the painting interacts with us. It's very dynamic and emotional. Now, I want to show you a landscape comparison between a Renaissance landscape and a Dutch Northern Baroque landscape. So as I zoom in here to this painting, we see the rising interest in perspective. And where do I see that? See all of these broken lances lying on the ground here? Notice that they form the diagonals that take us back here behind the main character, which is this central figure here. Now, I'm not going to say a lot about this figure because you have a video to watch that goes further in depth on both of these artworks. But I'm hoping you can get a sense of the stiffness of this painting. The space is very awkward. It seems to stop here, and it's kind of like a flat screen on a stage, and then behind here, aerial perspective disappears and one-point perspective disappear. In this beautiful landscape by Van Ryssendahl, we see a beautiful, moody picture that reflects the same kind of lighting that we saw in the Baroque painting by Rembrandt. Notice how the light kind of skips across the surface of the painting to kind of highlight certain areas. Now, this is an area where we have linen being laid out in the sun to bleach. And here we have a field. And then finally, we arrive at the light falling on the city. So it has this same kind of dynamic feel to it, even though it's a landscape. Also notice the turbulence in the clouds. In the landscape from the Renaissance, usually the skies are flat, blue, without much character to them. They're more like a backdrop. But here the sky begins to take up a goodly area on the canvas and becomes part of the painting. We have the use of tenebrism here, where we can't see the backsides of these cottages. They kind of disappear into the background, into the shaded trees and the areas behind them. I had you look and read some of the work by Sylvan Barnett about the kinds of questions you can ask about a landscape. The most important thing I believe to ask is, what is the relationship between people and nature? You can decide this by the size of the people, the proportions, the scale in relation to the nature that is being shown. So here in the Renaissance image, you can see that the people are fairly large within the landscape. The landscape forms a background to human action here. Here in this Baroque landscape, the people become minuscule, very small parts of the landscape, really not much more important than this windmill.